This presentation is one that I first made to a meeting of a SEN working group at Derby in May 2022. It represents some of the speculations and thoughts that I've been having over the last 2 years of lockdown and thinks about pollutants and pathogens, particularly in the context of rail and bus transport, and I produce what might be a useful framework for analysis for the future. If we look at consider a train and consider the pollutants around the train, obviously it takes in external pollutants from the environment, and the ones that are of interest are nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter, usually defined as particulate matter less than 2.5 or less than 10 microns. So that goes into the air conditioning system. It also produces its own exhaust, and similarly NO2, PM2.5 and PM10 that can again be entrained into the air conditioning system. So this set of pollutants comes into the cabin, where it's joined by pollutants from people. And these are mainly CO2 from the breathing process, but also pathogens, potentially during any time of infection. And of course, there's a dichotomy here. To keep pollutant rates low in the cabin requires low ventilation rates to stop them coming in from outside. To keep CO2 and pathogen level low, however, requires high ventilation rates. So there's something of a contradiction, and that's largely what I want to talk about in what follows. I'll talk first of all about the external pollutant environment, then about pollutants from exhausts, then about internal pollutants and pathogens, ventilation mechanisms, journey modelling, and finally look at pathogen infection probabilities. So the external pollution environment. This is by way of background. The pollutants of concern, as I've said, are the oxides of nitrogen, particulate matter PM10 and PM2.5. The areas of concern are in enclosed stations where such levels of those pollutants can be high, or in inner city areas, or in tunnels. For information, the current EU limits on these pollutants, which don't apply to the transport industry at all, but are indicative, that the hourly average of NO2 shouldn't exceed 200 micrograms per meter cubed for more than a certain number of times in a year, and the annual average shouldn't exceed 40 micrograms per meter cubed. For PM10, the daily average is 15 micrograms per meter cubed with an annual average of 40. And for PM2.5, an annual average of 20. And if we keep those figures in mind, they'll give a bit of context to what follows. Thinking about external pollutants, we did some work in 2016 at the Birmingham New Street station, which was rather a dark and depressing station in its old format up to 2014, before it was replaced by the new station. And Network Rail and the University of Birmingham took the opportunity to make pollutant measurements down at platform level at that time. And these have been widely reported, so I'm not going to talk in detail about them. But in essence, we made some detailed measurements of NO2 and particulates at a number of sensors along one of the platforms, as well as wider measurements across the station. And I plot here the concentrations of nitrogen dioxide and the particulates across the course of the measurements at the end of 2016, start of 2017. And if you think about those limits I just talked about of 200 micrograms per meter cubed for NO2 and between 20 and 50 for PM10, you can see they are quite significantly exceeded for many periods during the measurement period. Some interesting points on that graph, where I've just shown the shading, is actually the Christmas period when there are no trains, and you can see there the pollutant levels go very low. Similarly, a period in January 2017, and here there was quite a significant wind that was blowing wind through the station. The highest levels were frustratingly, just as we were packing up the equipment, in a period of almost no wind conditions. So even in a fairly enclosed station such as Birmingham New Street, there were significant meteorological effects. We also looked in more detail at the effect of different trains in the platform, and here are minute averages shown for the three pollutants, for the nitrogen dioxide rather, during the course of one day, when the presence or otherwise of various types of diesel train is indicated. There's not really much correlation between the actual train in the platform and the overall pollutant levels. The pollutant seems to mix very rapidly within the station. On the basis of this study, further work was done by the Railway Safety and Standards Board through the University, King's College in London, who measured pollutant levels in Edinburgh Waverley Station and London King's Cross as well. And those pollutant levels are shown on the x-axis of those graphs for the three stations, and the red lines show the limits. Birmingham New Street, in its old incarnation, can be seen to be worse than the others, although nitrogen dioxide levels are actually exceeded at the other stations as well. So that says a little about external pollutants in stations. There have been some recent measurements made in PM10 levels in a range of tunnels in Sweden, and the results there can be seen in histogram form. And when we compare those to the limits of 30 or to 50 micrograms per meter cubed, we can see very major exceedances indeed. And this is because of the dirty particulate environment within tunnels. A collation of data from around the world tells us the same story, with very high pollutant levels within tunnels. But in principle, the external concentration we can describe as some sort of function of train location and time. See external as a function of x and t. So we move on to pollutants from exhausts. And I'm going to talk here about some recent work that we've done with the Railway Safety and Standards Board that looked at how pollutants were drawn in from the exhaust into the air conditioning system. CFD modelling was used to measure that interaction, to look at the role of different design and operational factors that influence air quality on board the trains, and to develop a methodology to use CFD for this sort of analysis in the future. To produce a workable tool, there's a real need to use simple RANS modelling over more complex DES and LES. And the question really is RANS modelling good enough? We compared RANS modelling with LES modelling for that configuration of train, a 4-coach train. You can see where the exhaust pipes are. And we look here at the pollutant levels predicted by LES and RANS at lines 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see the further that we go away from the exhaust, the more the LES results are spread out. And that is simply because, of course, they reproduce the turbulence accurately. And the overall levels, average levels, are very much lower than the RANS levels. However, when we look at the results in detail, we came to the conclusion that the RANS levels are quite good approximations to the maximum values of the LES levels when the LES plume is above the HVAC or inlets at the lines under consideration. So a workable tool for looking at the highest levels of pollutant intake. We validated these on the moving model train rig. We measured velocities over the top of the train. And here we show ensemble averages of train velocities over the top, comparing experiment LES and RANS. LES is again the best, but we concluded that RANS was probably good enough. We also made some measurements at full scale on a heritage railway near Derby. And here we put pollutants from the exhaust into the airflow above the train and measure the concentrations downstream. And oddly, at first, we found that the concentrations were higher the further one goes from the exhaust. And this seems at first sight counterintuitive, but it was actually picked up by the CFD. And what is actually happening is the exhaust plume is being mixed and brought down to roof level, some significant distance away from the exhaust itself. So it offered a broad validation of the methodology. In a more detailed test, we looked at two base cases, one of a train with a really rather rough roof and one of a train, base case 2, with a smooth roof. And for the rough roof case, we found the plume was pushed away from the train roof near the exhaust by the roughness flow associated with the discontinuities. But for base case 2, the pollutant simply came down fairly immediately down onto the roof and spread along the roof. And what we show here are the concentrations at the various HVACs down the train. HVAC 1 is the first HVAC on coach 1 and so on. For the rough roof case shown by the circles and the smooth roof case shown by the triangles. And you can see the higher levels for the smooth roof case. We then did lots of experiments looking at lots of different sorts of geometric variable, and we found fundamentally the highest levels were at the rear car, and the things that most affected whether or not the levels were going to be high were the roof shape and the exhaust nozzle shape. Although it has to be said the results are very sensitive to any set of parameters, and any new train would have to have a separate investigation done, but we have here a proven methodology. So again, in principle, the exhaust concentration at the HVAC is a function of the exhaust location, the HVAC location, exhaust concentration, and exhaust emission rate, and the exhaust concentration and time, in principle. Now, very briefly, think about internal pollutants and pathogens. The input to the cabin is simply given by the number of passengers multiplied by the either the total number of people for carbon dioxide or for the number of infected passengers for pathogens. Obviously, CO2 is produced by all passengers and quite evenly distributed. Pathogens such as COVID-19 can tend to have localized hotspots as well as a general background level. So they're the different pollutants. What are the ventilation mechanisms that move these pollutants around? That shows a publicity leaflet produced by SNCF, who were very quick to realize that COVID was spread primarily by airflow rather than by touching surfaces. Ventilation is expressed in terms of air changes per hour, and there are a number of distinct mechanisms. HVAC ventilation, window ventilation, door ventilation, front to rear leakage, which is particularly important for buses and coaches, and leakage through the envelope. HVAC ventilation is mechanical ventilation, and the air changes per hour are simply a function of how efficient the HVAC system is and on the volume of the cabin. In trains and buses, one would normally be aiming for alpha air changes per hour due to HVAC, so somewhere of the order of 8 to 12. For window ventilation, we have what's called a shear layer ventilation, where the flow is driven by the shear layer passing over the open window. The formula we use here is based upon some building ventilation measurements that I was involved in almost 2 decades ago, which says that the ventilation air changes per hour is proportional to the opening area and the speed with which a train is moving. And if we put in some numbers there, we get for open windows, air changes per hour are between 10 and 20, which seems to match with experience. Similarly for doors, although the correlation is less certain here, we use the same sort of a correlation, but assume it's driven by a wind speed across the door when the door is open. And that gives us air exchange rates of the order of 11, but this is only for the very short time that the doors are open, of course. For buses and coaches, there can be a pressure-driven ventilation from front to rear, for which one can use a standard ventilation orifice flow model, as you can see there, that's driven by the pressure difference. And there, that gives ventilation rates of the order of 4 air changes per hour. And finally, there's ventilation due to envelope leakage, which is very important when it comes to pressure sealing considerations in tunnels. And that's driven by the difference between the internal and the external pressure, with the main parameter being the leakage time constant. Again, putting in some numbers gives us a very small ventilation rate here of only 0.1 air changes per hour. And so for the situation under consideration here, it's not really terribly important, and we won't consider it further. Okay, now where do we go from here? Having looked at the pollutant levels, the ventilation models, it seems to me that it would be far more efficient than the rather generalized imposition of restrictions that went on during the current pandemic to try to model individual journeys and to find out when both pollutants and pathogens can have high levels. So I set up a very simple model of the concentration of pollutants in can be railway or bus cabins due to the different types of ventilation, perhaps allowing for circulated air and for some degree of cleaning of the air. And we have a very simple equation that's been used by many people in some form or other that says the rate of change of circulation is proportional to the air changes per hour multiplied by the external concentration, seems very sensible, plus an inlet pollution or pathogen term, and then a term that allows for the air changes per hour, the clean air circulation per hour, the rate of pollutant or pathogen decay, and deposition per hour. A very simple equation. We then apply that to specific situations. I consider first a rail route, where we start in an enclosed station, go through a series of tunnels and urban stations out into a rural area with rural stations. And here, at each of those stations, I specify a set of pollutant concentrations. And these are high in what one might expect to be polluted areas, in tunnels and in inner city stations, and low in other areas. I then specify a number of different rail scenarios: full HVAC operation, controlled HVAC operation, which turns the HVAC off when you're in polluted areas such as train stations and tunnels, window and doors only. And if you look at them, there's some interesting points. We show the scenario 1 here for, this is for NO2. Scenario 1, concentrations increase in the highly polluted station, and then as the HVAC system pulls it in, and then gradually decrease. The controlled HVAC scenario in scenario 2 controls the high levels in the initial station and tunnels, but then we come back to similar levels to the full HVAC situation further down the line. Scenario 3, windows and doors, high levels in the station, but then rapidly decreasing as we go away from the polluted area. The doors only scenario is very similar to the full HVAC scenario. Similar sorts of figures really for PM10 and PM2.5. For CO2, which is, remember, an internally generated pollutant, things are a little different. And here the highest levels are for scenario 4, the most enclosed of the scenarios, where the high levels are kept in, and the lowest levels are for the other scenarios are in the rural areas, with some peaks for scenario 2, the controlled HVAC, when the HVAC is turned off in the tunnel areas near the start of the route. For pathogens, again, it's a very similar situation, with the most enclosed scenario 4, showing the highest levels. The scenarios for the other levels tend towards the same value as the journey goes on, with high levels for scenario 2 when the HVAC is turned off near the start of the journey. We also did a similar thing for a bus route, again going from a bus station in a city area along city roads, suburban roads, and urban roads, and rural roads. There again, I defined a number of scenarios. Scenario 5, windows, doors, and front rear leakage. So leakage for ventilation from having all windows and doors open, and also the leakage back to front. Scenario 6 is having the windows shut, as one might expect during less clement weather. And the situations are again fairly similar. The more enclosed scenario 6, has higher levels of NO2, largely because it sort of tends to keep the NO2 from the urban area inside the cabin here. For PM2.5, a little different, but similar sorts of level. But here, of course, this is affected by whatever the external level might be. For CO2, we have very high levels for scenario 6, when that's the enclosed one where the windows are shut, and the same is true for COVID-19 pathogens. So when we put all that together and calculate the average values for the journey for each of those 4 scenarios, we see that the highest values for the nitrogen dioxide and for the particulates tend to be for those scenarios where it's actually quite well ventilated. Not wholly, but mainly. For CO2 and for COVID, the highest values are particularly for the less well ventilated cases, when the pathogens or CO2 build up during the course of the journey. So we go on from there now to think specifically about pathogens, and in particular infection probabilities. For infection probabilities, the dose of the pathogen is important. And the dose is basically the rate of breathing in, multiplied by the journey time, multiplied by the average concentration. And that can come from an individual, from background concentrations and localized hotspots. There's a fairly standard formula that allows for this, that allows one to calculate the probability of infection, that relates the dose D to the population probability of infection, little p, to the fraction of people who are immune, F sub I, and to the wearing of masks, and the fraction of people wearing masks and the mask breathing out and breathing in efficiencies. K there is a factor that allows for pathogen variance. If it were 1 for the initial COVID variant, it will be of the order of 10 for the Omicron variant. That can be simplified for small doses and long journeys to a nice linear expression. The average concentration there is the time average concentration of pathogen in seat I due to an infected passenger in seat J, summed over all pairs of I and J. And it gives a relatively simple formula at the end. Getting that rather complex looking average concentration, one might think, is difficult, but actually there's been some very interesting recent work by Lee and al. Just published in 2022, who looked at the spread of pathogens, carbon dioxide, from every individual in a carriage using CFD, and they were able to describe where people's breath went and who inhaled whose breath. In other words, they effectively gave that concentration matrix Cij. Very nice piece of work indeed. So, can pathogen infection probabilities be used for rational imposition of restrictions? Well, what we have there, that final expression, QIT bar, that's basically all about the journey and about the passengers. And you can calculate that, that's fairly general. PK1 minus FI is something about the state of the epidemic or pandemic. The P is the infection probability, FI is the level of immunity. And the last term is all to do with social distancing, the number of passengers in the vehicle, and the effect of mask wearing, the mask terms there. And you see that expression there allows one to specify fairly rationally a parameter P, an infection probability, what is acceptable. And then to say, well, that may increase or decrease during the state of the epidemic. The absolute levels are going to be controlled by the journey, by T and C. But as the probability, as the state of the epidemic changes, and so P and FI change, one could also make changes to N, the number of passengers, and whether or not one enforces mask wearing. And it gives potentially a rational way of bringing in restrictions that can vary through the course of the pandemic to keep the infection probabilities something around the same. So that's what I want to say, ladies and gentlemen. I did offer the opportunity when I first gave this presentation of questions. I would be more than happy to receive them by email, should you wish to send any to me via the website. Thank you very much indeed for listening.